The Los Angeles International Airport was bustling as usual, with a constant flow of people, each engrossed in their own journey. Among them was a tall black man with a calm yet commanding presence, striding confidently through the security checkpoint. He was James Carter, a seasoned Secret Service agent renowned for his quick thinking and composure under pressure. James wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit with a crisp white shirt underneath, understated yet exuding professionalism. Every move he made was deliberate, each step seemingly calculated. In his role as a presidential protection agent, he was accustomed to blending into crowds without drawing attention. In his hand was a sleek black briefcase, filled with classified documents and a specially authorized handgun. His polished leather shoes clicked steadily on the airport's tiled floor, merging with the surrounding cacophony. James knew today's flight wasn't just another routine mission. It was a critical challenge to ensure the utmost safety of the head of state. Though his face betrayed no emotion, his sharp eyes swept constantly over the crowd. He observed every detail, from weary passengers waiting to board to security staff inspecting luggage. He entered the VIP lounge, where a few other passengers were already seated. Finding a spot near the window, James placed his briefcase on the adjacent seat and settled into the chair. While his posture appeared relaxed, his mind was in overdrive, running through potential scenarios. Flight 112, destination Washington, D.C. Now boarding, announced the overhead speaker, stirring the surrounding atmosphere into motion. James rose, took his briefcase, and proceeded to board the plane. He quickly located his seat in the middle section of the aircraft. It wasn't in first class, but it was positioned strategically to give him a clear view of the cabin without drawing undue attention to himself. James fastened his seatbelt and gazed out of the window, though his eyes weren't truly focused on the view. His thoughts were centered on the mission ahead, safeguarding the president, who would board shortly after him. Although this wasn't his first high-stakes assignment, James never allowed himself even a moment of complacency. In another corner of the airport, two police officers, Michael Grant and John Myers, were getting ready to board the same flight. They weren't on duty but were simply regular passengers on vacation. Grant was a middle-aged man with short brown hair, a stocky build, and eyes that always carried an air of suspicion. Myers, younger with closely cropped blonde hair, had a more relaxed demeanor, though his gaze was quick to assess everyone around him. They boarded the plane, each carrying a small travel bag. Both were seated a few rows behind James. From the moment they stepped onto the plane, Grant's attention was drawn to James. His confident bearing and composed demeanor made it hard for Grant to look away. He leaned toward Myers and whispered, "See that guy over there? Something about him seems off." Myers glanced briefly at James and shrugged. Probably just a businessman. But Grant wasn't so quick to dismiss his unease. The presence of James, a black man with a commanding aura, stirred an underlying discomfort in him. Deep-seated prejudices, long ingrained, began to surface, though he had no concrete reason. Grant couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the man. The flight began to stabilize. Passengers settled into their seats, some engaging in quiet conversations, others scrolling through their phones or preparing to take a nap. James remained in his seat, his eyes continuously scanning the cabin, observing even the smallest actions around him. Grant and Myers, seated a few rows behind James, began whispering to each other. Their gazes repeatedly darted toward him, filled with suspicion. A black man dressed like that, carrying a black briefcase. "What's he doing here?" Grant muttered, his voice low but tinged with doubt. "Maybe he's just an ordinary guy," Myers replied, though a trace of skepticism had crept into his tone. "But it is odd. Why is he sitting near the VIP section?" Grant nodded, convinced his suspicions were valid. To him, the sight of a black man exuding such authority and confidence seemed unusual. He continued watching James, his gaze growing heavier with judgment. Meanwhile, James could feel the eyes on him from behind. He didn't turn around but was fully aware of the presence of the two officers. This wasn't the first time he had faced such scrutinizing looks, and he had learned to ignore them. Yet this time, the intensity of their attention was greater than usual, making it impossible for him not to notice. Unable to hold back any longer, Grant stood up, motioning for Myers to follow. The two approached James's seat, their eyes filled with suspicion. James looked up, his face calm but his gaze sharp. "Hello, I'm Officer Michael Grant, and this is John Myers. We'd like to see your identification," Grant said, his tone anything but friendly. James was slightly taken aback but maintained his composure. He calmly retrieved his Secret Service badge from his jacket pocket and placed it in Grant's waiting hand. "I'm James Carter, Special Agent with the United States Secret Service. I'm currently on duty." Grant took the badge, glancing over it briefly but without any real intention of verifying it. He exchanged a look with Myers before handing it back. "Secret Service agent?" Grant said with a mocking tone. "Someone like you, an agent." James took a deep breath, striving to remain composed. He knew this wasn't just a routine check, it was driven by prejudice. "I'm here to protect the president. If you don't mind, I need to focus on my assignment." But Grant wasn't letting it go. He stared at James, his eyes full of challenge. "If you really are an agent, why are you sitting here? And what about that gun you're carrying?" James sensed the tension escalating. He realized that no explanation he gave would likely satisfy these men. He could feel the potential for a confrontation looming, one that could spiral out of control. The atmosphere on the plane grew tense as Grant and Myers continued to press James Carter. They didn't stop at verifying his identification but began raising their voices, drawing the attention of other passengers. A few people nearby turned to look, curious about what was happening. Grant, with a cold, stern expression, pointed directly at James's firearm and shouted, "He's armed. This is a clear threat. Drop the weapon immediately." His outburst silenced the entire cabin. Passengers began murmuring among themselves, with some ducking low in their seats out of fear. James remained calm, raising his hands slowly, his voice steady but firm. "You're misunderstanding. I'm a United States Secret Service agent, and this weapon is part of my official duty. Please, stay calm." But his words fell on deaf ears. Grant and Myers were now entirely consumed by suspicion and prejudice. To them, the sight of a black man with a weapon was enough to deem James a threat. Myers swiftly drew his own firearm, pointing it directly at James. "Get down now. If you don't cooperate, we'll take you down by force." James slowly lowered his hands, his eyes scanning the frightened passengers around him. He knew that any misstep could escalate the situation further. With a measured and resolute tone, he replied, "I will comply, but you need to listen to me. Your actions here will have serious consequences." Grant and Myers gave James no further opportunity to explain. Grant lunged forward, yanking James's arm and forcing him down onto the aisle floor. A loud thud echoed as James's body hit the hard surface of the plane. He grimaced but didn't resist, fully aware that any attempt to fight back could escalate the already volatile situation. Myers knelt down, forcefully handcuffing James's wrists. Passengers around them screamed in fear, some pulling out their phones to record the incident. James kept his voice calm, speaking clearly, "I have my credentials and a firearm permit. Check my briefcase." Grant ignored him entirely. He rummaged through James's briefcase, pulling out the Secret Service badge but barely glancing at it before dismissing it. His voice was sharp and accusatory. "This could easily be fake. Don't think you can fool us so easily." James felt anger rising within him, but he kept it in check. As an agent, he was trained to remain composed in all situations, and this was no exception. He knew the truth would come to light soon enough. The two officers escorted James off the plane as stunned passengers looked on. Some cast sympathetic glances in his direction, while others turned away silently, unwilling to intervene. James was led through the airport terminal, where a few security personnel began to take notice of the commotion. Grant and Myers escorted James into a small interrogation room in the airport security area. The room was stark, with 4 plain white walls, a cold metal table, and 2 simple chairs. They shoved James into one of the chairs and cuffed his hands to the table before beginning their questioning. Grant leaned over the table, planting his hands firmly on its surface as he stared down at James, his expression full of challenge. "Now, talk. Who are you? And what were you planning on that flight?" James took a deep breath, keeping his tone calm and measured. "I've already told you, I am a Secret Service agent, and I am on a mission to protect the president. Detaining me here isn't just wrong. It could jeopardize national security." Myers, standing behind Grant with his arms crossed, sneered. "Protect the president? That's laughable. Someone like you, trusted with such an important task." James raised his head, locking eyes with Myers. "Your doubts don't change the facts. The president will hear about this, and you'll face the consequences of your actions." Grant dismissed the warning, uninterested in James's claims. He continued to press him with questions, but James remained silent, realizing that no explanation would satisfy them. He sat still, his hands cuffed, but his gaze steady and unwavering, exuding confidence despite the situation. While James was being detained at the airport, another agent on the plane noticed his absence. Agent Karen Morris, a close colleague of James, began to sense something was wrong. She knew James would never leave his position without a valid reason. Karen immediately reported the situation to their team leader, who escalated it to the president. Upon hearing the news, the president ordered the flight to be halted for verification. At the airport, the president's security team quickly launched an investigation. They checked the passenger manifest and discovered that James had been escorted off the plane by 2 police officers. The situation quickly escalated when the security team found that Grant and Myers had failed to properly verify James's credentials. His badge was entirely legitimate, and his detention was a grave mistake. The president decided to intervene personally. He instructed his entire security detail to accompany him to the airport to secure James's release. Before leaving the plane, he addressed his security chief. "We're not just defending one agent. This is a matter of principle and justice. They need to understand that no one has the right to act on prejudice and harm others." At the airport, Grant and Myers were still interrogating James when the door to the interrogation room suddenly swung open. The president and his entourage entered, leaving both officers stunned. A heavy silence filled the room as the president fixed a stern gaze on Grant and Myers. "You just detained one of my finest agents and jeopardized national security. Explain yourselves now." The tension in the room became palpable as the weight of the situation settled in, and the truth began to unfold. The tension in the interrogation room was palpable as the president entered. His entourage followed, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the small room with caution. Michael Grant and John Myers, the 2 police officers who had been loudly intimidating James Carter moments earlier, froze in place. They exchanged uneasy glances, unable to react to the sudden presence of the President of the United States. The president, a dignified man with silver hair and piercing eyes, approached James. Upon seeing his agent handcuffed, a flash of anger crossed his face but was quickly subdued. Turning to Grant and Myers, his voice was calm but carried undeniable authority. "Can you explain why one of my finest agents is being treated like a criminal?" Grant swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice as he replied, nervously, "Mr. President, we thought he was a threat. He was armed and claimed to be a Secret Service agent, but we couldn't verify it immediately." Myers interjected, attempting to justify their actions. "We were just doing our duty to ensure the safety of the flight. There have been many cases of impersonators." And the president raised a hand, cutting him off. His sharp gaze shifted between the 2 officers, his tone turning colder. "Did you thoroughly check his credentials?" Or did you simply make assumptions based on his appearance? Grant and Myers fell silent. Unable to answer, the president turned to his security chief, who handed him James Carter's confiscated badge. Examining it closely, the president looked back at Grant and Myers. This is a valid Secret Service badge, issued by the United States government. Your failure to verify this information and your actions afterward are not only an insult to my agent but also a threat to national security. Do you realize the serious consequences of your negligence? The two officers hung their heads, too ashamed to meet his gaze. They now understood the gravity of their mistake, far beyond what they had anticipated. Grant stammered, We're sorry. We didn't know." James remained seated, his expression calm and composed. His eyes met the president's with a look of trust. The president nodded slightly at James before issuing a firm order. "Uncuff Agent Carter immediately." Grant and Myers scrambled to comply. Quickly removing the handcuffs, James stood, rubbing his wrists lightly but maintaining his professional demeanor. He said nothing, standing quietly beside the president, ready to receive his next directive. The president took a deep breath, striving to maintain his composure in the face of the situation. He understood that the issue went beyond the mistakes of two officers. It was a symptom of deeply ingrained prejudices that society had yet to fully eradicate. Looking around the room, his voice was firm and resolute. "This incident is not just a simple mistake. It is a stark example of the danger of letting bias guide actions. People like Agent Carter have dedicated their lives to protecting this nation. Yet, because of the color of his skin, he was treated like a criminal." Grant and Myers kept their heads bowed, too ashamed to argue. The president continued, "I will not let this matter go without consequences. You need to learn to act based on evidence, not prejudice, and I will ensure that you, along with the entire law enforcement system, come to understand this." Turning to the security chief, he issued a directive. "Ensure that Grant and Myers are enrolled in cultural awareness and professional conduct training programs. I want a full report on their progress." The security chief nodded, jotting down notes quickly. The president then turned to James, his tone softening. "Carter, I apologize for the injustice you've faced today. This should never have happened, and I promise we will do everything in our power to prevent similar incidents in the future." James nodded, his voice calm as he replied, "Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to continue performing my duty and ensuring your safety." Before leaving the room, the president instructed Grant and Myers to issue a formal apology to James. Although visibly uncomfortable, the two complied. Grant stepped forward first, his voice hesitant. "Agent Carter, I sincerely apologize for my actions. We were wrong not to properly verify your credentials and for letting bias cloud our judgment." Myers followed, echoing the apology, though his tone was somewhat awkward, carried genuine remorse. James listened intently, his expression serious. After a brief silence, he responded, "I accept your apology, but I hope you take this as a learning experience. Your duty is to uphold justice, not to judge others based on their skin color or appearance." Grant and Myers nodded, their faces contemplative. They understood that an apology alone could not undo their mistake, but they hoped it would be the first step toward making amends. The president led James out of the interrogation room and back to the airport security area. A large crowd of passengers and airport staff had gathered, watching the situation unfold with curiosity. As James walked out alongside the president, a ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some recognized him as the man who had been escorted off the plane earlier. The president stepped forward and addressed the airport security team. "Ensure that this entire incident is documented and thoroughly reported. This is a lesson that must be shared widely to prevent similar mistakes in the future." James was escorted back to the plane, where passengers had already settled into their seats. As he walked down the aisle, a few passengers nodded in a show of sympathy and respect. Some even offered small applause to express their support. James maintained his composed demeanor, though he felt a sense of relief knowing the truth had been revealed. Returning to his seat, James prepared to resume his duties. He gazed out the window, his expression reflective. The events of the day were a bitter reminder of the realities he faced, but they also reinforced his belief that justice and professionalism would always prevail. The president returned to his seat, signaling to James that the matter had been resolved. They exchanged a look of mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement that their work was far from over. Both knew they had to continue the fight, not just for the nation's safety but for something greater: fairness and human dignity. Seated back on the plane, James Carter closed his eyes for a moment, trying to relax after the recent events. Yet, his mind raced with thoughts and memories from the past. This wasn't the first time James had faced discrimination, but this time, it had happened while he was on duty protecting the nation. The injustice stirred bitter memories from his journey to becoming a Secret Service agent. James was born and raised in a poor neighborhood in Chicago. As the son of a mechanic and an elementary school teacher, he learned early on the value of hard work and perseverance from his parents. Yet, throughout his youth, he was often met with unfair treatment and skeptical glances from others, solely because of his skin color. He vividly recalled the first time he was pulled over by the police at just 16 years old. He had been driving his father's old car to deliver some repair tools. A police officer had demanded he step out of the car, searching it thoroughly without offering any explanation. Afterward, they let him go without so much as an apology. That incident left a lasting mark on his young mind. James chose a career in law enforcement not just because he wanted to protect others, but also to prove that a black man could hold a position of authority and justice without being swayed by prejudice. Over the years, he endured grueling tests and challenges, demonstrating not just equality with his peers but often surpassing them. Serving on the president's security detail was a tremendous honor. But today's actions by Grant and Myers reminded James that the fight against discrimination was far from over. While James was lost in thought, the president stood and walked over to his seat, gently placing a hand on James's shoulder. The president's eyes reflected both empathy and deep respect. "Carter, I know today has been tough for you. You're not just an outstanding agent but a resilient man. Your composure and professionalism today have only deepened my admiration for you." James looked up, meeting the president's gaze. He gave a slight nod, his voice steady yet firm. "Thank you, Mr. President. I'm just doing my job. However, what happened today is a reminder that we need to do more to educate and change the way people perceive one another." The president sighed, his eyes momentarily distant. "I agree. The system isn't perfect, and we need people like you to keep making it better. I promise to take concrete action after this incident, not only to protect agents like you, but to prevent similar injustices from happening to anyone." The brief yet meaningful conversation left James feeling seen and valued. He resolved to continue his work, not just to protect the president but also to prove his worth and advocate for the broader community. After the flight landed, the president ordered an emergency meeting with the National Security Leadership Team and other relevant officials. During the meeting, he recounted the details of the discrimination James had faced, emphasizing that this was not merely an individual mistake but a systemic issue that required resolution. "We cannot allow prejudices like this to persist within a system that is meant to uphold fairness and equality for all citizens," the president said, his tone resolute. He called for the establishment of a mandatory training program on cultural awareness and anti-discrimination for all law enforcement and security personnel. The president also appointed a special committee to review current security screening procedures to ensure that no one is judged solely on their appearance or background. James's story was used as a case study in these training sessions, not only to highlight the harmful consequences of discrimination but also to celebrate his resilience and professionalism. News of the incident quickly spread across media outlets. Videos recorded by passengers on the plane were widely shared on social media, sparking public outrage. Many expressed anger over the actions of Grant and Myers, while others admired James's composure and professionalism. Human rights organizations, social activists, and even high-ranking officials called for systemic reform. The hashtag Justice for Carter rapidly became a trending topic, with millions of posts supporting James and advocating for the eradication of discrimination within law enforcement. Though James chose not to engage in the social media discussions, he received thousands of letters and messages of gratitude from around the world. These letters came not only from admirers but also from people who had experienced similar injustices. One letter from a young black boy in Texas particularly moved him. "I want to grow up to be like you, strong and not letting anyone judge me just because of my skin color. Thank you for giving me hope." James read the letter multiple times, drawing strength from its words. He knew his fight was no longer just for himself. It was for the generations to come. A week after the incident at the airport, James Carter was summoned to the White House, though he was familiar with the environment after years of service. This time felt different. The president had personally requested a meeting with James to discuss reform plans and the events of the previous week. In a private meeting room, the president and senior officials greeted James with respect in their eyes. The president opened the discussion by expressing his gratitude once again. "Carter, I've thought a lot about what happened. It's not just about the mistakes of two officers. It's about a much larger issue within the system. I want you to know that your calmness and professionalism have illuminated the changes we need to make." James sat upright, listening attentively. The president continued, "We are preparing to launch a comprehensive reform program, and I want you to play a leadership role in it. You will be appointed to a senior position within the Department of Homeland Security, where you will lead initiatives to enhance cultural awareness and combat discrimination within law enforcement agencies." James felt a mixture of surprise and emotion. This was an opportunity to drive real change. But he also understood the immense responsibility it entailed. After a brief pause, he responded firmly, "I am honored to take on this mission, Mr. President. I will do everything in my power to ensure incidents like this never happen again." The meeting ended with determined handshakes. That day, James was no longer just a Secret Service agent. He became a symbol of change within the system. Under James's leadership, the reform program was implemented with vigor. A nationwide training initiative for law enforcement officers was launched, focusing on unconscious bias awareness, evidence-based decision-making, and respect for human rights. James was directly involved in designing the program. He used his own story as a powerful example to emphasize the importance of eliminating bias. During a major training session in Washington, he stood before hundreds of officers from across the country and shared, "I'm not here to criticize or condemn anyone. I'm here to work with you to build a better system. We all make mistakes, but what truly matters is what we learn from them. Every decision you make doesn't just impact one person, it can affect an entire community, even the nation." His words left a profound impression, earning widespread support from many officers. Some approached him after the session to express their gratitude, admitting they had never considered the issues James had raised. Beyond the training sessions, James pushed for reforms in the recruitment and evaluation processes within law enforcement agencies. He proposed regular psychological assessments and periodic interviews to ensure that personal biases did not interfere with officers' duties. While the reforms were underway, James received word that officers Michael Grant and John Myers wanted to meet him to personally apologize and discuss the incident. Initially, James was unsure whether their remorse was genuine or driven by public and institutional pressure. However, with his professional approach and his commitment to fostering change, he agreed to the meeting. The meeting took place at a newly established training center created as part of James's reform program. The small conference room, simply yet respectfully decorated, provided a welcoming but serious atmosphere. When Grant and Myers entered, they looked tense, dressed in their police uniforms. Their eyes betrayed a sense of apprehension. James stood up and greeted them with a slight nod. After a brief silence, Grant was the first to speak. "Carter, I want to say that we are truly sorry for what we did to you. At the time, we didn't see you as a person. We only saw the assumptions created in our own minds. Myers nodded in agreement and added, "These past few days, we've thought a lot about our actions. We've come to realize that our ignorance and prejudice didn't just harm you. They also undermined the public's trust in the system we're supposed to represent." James listened attentively, his gaze calm yet commanding. After they finished, he responded, "I appreciate your sincerity today. I accept your apology. But what's more important is that you take action to change. This isn't just about correcting personal mistakes. It's about helping build a fairer system." The conversation lasted over an hour. The three discussed how bias can influence judgment and actions, as well as ways to improve empathy and fairness within law enforcement. By the end of the meeting, Grant and Myers pledged to actively participate in the reform programs and share the lessons they'd learned with their colleagues. As the two officers left, James felt a sense of relief. This wasn't just a personal step forward. It was a positive sign of broader change within the entire system. Several months later, the reform program led by James began to show significant results. Reports from across the country noted a marked reduction in cases of discrimination within law enforcement. Stories of officers handling situations with fairness and respect became increasingly common, restoring new confidence in communities. James, now a prominent figure in the Department of Homeland Security, received invitations to speak at numerous international conferences to share his experience. However, he remained grounded, refusing to let the recognition distract him. For James, the mission was clear: to continue building a more just society. One evening, after a long day of work, James returned home to find a letter from the president waiting for him. In the letter, the president wrote, "Carter, you have achieved far more than I ever expected. You are not just an outstanding agent, but also a true source of inspiration. Your story reminds us that change doesn't only come from those at the top. It comes from courageous individuals willing to stand up for truth and justice. I know your journey is far from over, but I have every confidence that you will always stay on the right path." James smiled and placed the letter in a drawer. He gazed out the window at the city lights twinkling in the night. Although the road ahead remained full of challenges, he felt hopeful. The incident at the airport was no longer a moment to forget, but a turning point that had transformed his life and the system he served. Taking a deep breath, James reminded himself that he wasn't just representing himself. He was representing millions of people yearning for a fairer future. With that thought, he felt ready to continue his journey, no matter how difficult it might become.